whisper lingers in the fog, soft, sorrowful, and unanswered. They say someone stood at every grave, cloaked in black, mourning names no one remembered. No theft, no blood, no villain. And yet something deeper than crime lies buried here. A mystery of silence, of memory, of grief, too long endured. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It is an oft-forgotten truth that not all of Sherlock Holmes's most compelling investigations were born of violence or marked by public spectacle. Some rather bore the unmistakable quiet of tragedy, of human sorrow so deep, so unresolved, that even Holmes, for all his famed detachment, carried the weight of it long after the final facts had been unearthed. This is one such case. I had long intended to set it down in my chronicles, yet for years I resisted the impulse, unsure whether its essence lent itself to paper. There was no grand villain, no chase across rooftops, no clattering carriage through gaslit fog. And yet, I can scarcely recall a more affecting episode in our long association. It began, as so many did, in the sitting room at Baker Street, with Holmes sprawled upon the settee, his long fingers steepled, and his gaze fixed somewhere well beyond the window pane. The fire crackled low, and the smoke of his cigarette curled like ghostly script upon the air. That morning, a single letter, thin, pale, and trembling with ink, altered the course of our week and plunged us into a mystery as delicate as it was dreadful. The envelope bore the seal of St. Jude's Parish, Hampstead, a modest, ivy-clad church whose name I recalled only vaguely from the peripheries of our London map. Holmes, whose knowledge of ecclesiastical architecture was remarkably poor, made no comment as he slit open the flap with the tip of his penknife. He read in silence, his brows drawing together in faint perplexity as the contents unfolded. When at last he lowered the sheet, he handed it to me with the briefest of nods. "Read, Watson. I believe you shall find it unusual." The letter, penned by a Reverend Josiah Pritchard, described a curious and deeply unsettling phenomenon. At a number of recent funerals held at St. Jude's, a figure had appeared, always alone, always cloaked in deepest black, and always heavily veiled. This person, referred to by the rector simply as the mourner, made no contact with the bereaved, spoke to no one, and vanished as quietly as they had come. Attempts to engage the mourner had failed. They slipped away with uncanny speed, leaving no name, no trace, not even footprints upon the gravel paths. "I do not suggest spectres," the rector wrote cautiously, "but there is something unnatural in grief that attaches itself so persistently to strangers." Holmes tapped the letter thoughtfully. "A mourning figure who mourns for none who know them. Curious, is it not?" The rector's letter included a modest log of the occurrences, 8 funerals in total, spanning just under 3 months. There was no discernible pattern in the deceased: a retired bookbinder, a laundress, a child of 5, a clerk dismissed for embezzlement. The only constant was the mourner's presence, silent, shrouded, and watchful. Holmes's attention was particularly drawn to one entry, the 4th, concerning an elderly widower whose funeral was sparsely attended. The mourner, according to the verger, had arrived early and stood immobile at the farthest edge of the cemetery, just within sight and just outside the ring of mourners. When the final words were spoken and the family turned away, the figure departed through the hedge without so much as a rustle. "A habit," Holmes murmured, "not born of recent invention. Whoever this individual may be, they have practiced their vanishing act well." I confess I found the affair disquieting. There was something in the rector's tone, measured though it was, that suggested unease had given way to dread. I inquired if Holmes suspected a criminal motive. "Not yet," he replied, tapping ash into the grate. But any pattern of behaviour that so deliberately eludes notice is worth our scrutiny. He gazed at the fire, and I knew at once that the game, in some form, was afoot. The most recent funeral mentioned in the rector's correspondence concerned a young governess named Clara Lonsdale, deceased at the age of 29. The cause was listed as a sudden illness, though Reverend Pritchard hinted that her demise had left an air of quiet suspicion. No family had come forward to claim her, and she was buried at the expense of a former employer. It was here, the rector noted, that the mourner's behaviour shifted subtly. For the first time, the veiled figure approached the grave directly, after the mourners had departed. A church groundskeeper, watching from a respectful distance, observed them remove a single item from beneath their cloak, a withered white rose. This they placed upon the soil before retreating wordlessly. The rose, left to decay upon the grave, seemed a strange token, neither fresh nor pressed, but desiccated, as if drawn from some personal reliquary. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A detail, Watson," he said quietly, "which suggests attachment, not impersonality. This mourner may mourn with intent." There was, at last, a tangible thread, something physical, something chosen, and from that moment, Holmes's interest deepened. By noon, Holmes had dispatched a brief telegram to Reverend Pritchard, requesting an interview the following morning. He made no further comment on the case until late afternoon, when he rose, stretched, and announced he would require my company on the morrow. "It is, I think, a puzzle of grief rather than guilt," he remarked, "and yet I cannot shake the notion that one may conceal the other." I asked what he hoped to find. "Patterns, my dear Watson, patterns in footsteps, in rituals, in silence itself. If this mourner acts according to some internal logic, then we may yet uncover the rationale behind their solitary vigils." He paused, then added almost absently, "And perhaps, in doing so, bring comfort to more than one soul wandering that graveyard." With that cryptic note, he resumed his violin, and the room once more filled with slow, searching tones. That evening, as the fire burned low and the fog coiled like smoke against the panes, I found myself uncharacteristically unsettled. It was not fear, precisely, but the sense of an unseen presence, of a sorrow unvoiced, drifting between headstones and hedgerows, seeking something neither spoken nor understood. Holmes sat quietly by the hearth, his eyes closed, the violin now silent across his knees. He had not spoken for some time. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I ventured at last. His eyes opened, sharp and grey in the dim light. "I make of it," he said, "a mystery crafted not by malice, but memory." He stood, pulled the curtains tighter against the mist, and turned away. And so, with no more than a letter and a white rose, we prepared to follow the shadow of the mourner, into Hampstead, and into one of the strangest cases we would ever know. The following morning found us upon the road to Hampstead, the mist lingering about the hedgerows and the trees bowed under the weight of autumn damp. Holmes was in one of his reticent moods, speaking little, save for the occasional cryptic comment on the psychology of grief and the persistence of ritual among those in mourning. I, for my part, confined myself to observation, my curiosity piqued, but my mind clouded by an inexplicable sense of foreboding. At St. Jude's, we were received by the Reverend Josiah Pritchard, a tall, spare man with kindly eyes and the complexion of one who had long laboured beneath grey skies. He welcomed us into the vestry, where he had laid out a leather-bound ledger and several handwritten notes upon the table. "I cannot say precisely when it began," the rector explained, motioning us to sit. "Only that I first noticed the figure shortly after the burial of Mrs. Amelia Cartwright in late August." The ledger was remarkable in its detail. Each funeral listed therein had been accompanied by an annotation from the rector or one of his assistants. The appearances of the veiled mourner had been carefully recorded, always with dates, times and subtle observations, whether the figure had stood near or far, whether they lingered or left with haste. 8 funerals, Holmes murmured, scanning the entries. All within the parish, yet no inquiry, no complaint, no disturbance. The rector nodded gravely. Not one. And yet each time, there is a chill, an uncanny presence. I do not call it evil, Mr. Holmes, but it is not wholly at peace. Holmes closed the ledger and folded his hands. You have done wisely to record without interference, Reverend, he said. Now let us see whether the living may yet explain the habits of the silent dead, or those who grieve for them. Our next inquiry took us beyond the churchyard to the modest lodgings of Mrs. Eliza Stone, a long-serving groundskeeper's widow who had remained in residence near the cemetery. A woman of formidable plainness and sharp gaze, she met us at her threshold with a brisk nod and an apron still dusted in soot. You've come about the Black Wraith, I reckon, she said without preamble. Saw it myself more than once. Always the same. Stood still as a post, not 5 feet from the north obelisk. Gave me the shivers. Holmes invited her to recount the most recent instance, which concerned the funeral of Miss Clara Lonsdale. Mrs. Stone's memory proved unimpeachable. It was near sundown, she said. The other mourners had left, and I was raking up behind the main path. I turned round, and there it was. Black veil, thin as bone, hands like marble. They knelt and laid a flower on the grave. What sort of flower? Holmes asked. A rose, she said at once. But it was odd. White, aye, but not fresh, dried like it had been pressed between books, crumbled at the edges, like paper. Holmes's eyes gleamed for an instant, and they said nothing, not a word, stood, turned, and slipped into the trees. He thanked her with quiet courtesy, then paused at the door. The same flower at each grave, he inquired. Her brow furrowed. Yes, always the same. Holmes turned to me as we stepped out into the cold. A signature, Watson, he said softly. The hand may vanish, but the mark remains. Back at the rectory, Holmes spent the better part of an hour poring over the names of the deceased, cross-referencing each entry with parish registers, local death notices, and several publications he'd requested by telegram from London. I busied myself by transcribing his notes, though I could make little sense of the aim behind the work. They come from every manner of life, Holmes muttered, scanning the page. An upholsterer, a maid, a child, a schoolmaster. No overlapping employment, no shared residences, not even an evident social connection. He stood and paced, fingers drumming along the windowsill. I had hoped, he continued, to find at least one common element: birthplace, physician, solicitor, anything. But it is maddeningly scattered. And yet the mourner attended each one, I said. Surely that constitutes some connection. Indeed. But not a present one, Watson. We are dealing with a spider whose web is spun far behind the curtain of time. The threads that bind these dead to our mysterious visitor are not of recent weaving. He picked up the list again and tapped it thoughtfully. There is a unity here, he murmured, but it is of memory, not proximity. The question is, what sort of past touches so many, yet leaves so little trace in the present? The church bell tolled in the distance, solemn and slow. Holmes did not move. Find me the moment they cease to be strangers to one another, he said at last, and you shall find the mourner. It was upon Holmes's request that we spoke next to Mr. Tom Brackley, a stout and weather-beaten fellow who had served as the church's principal gravedigger for over 2 decades. We found him by the toolshed, sharpening his spade with a rhythmical scrape that echoed faintly against the headstones. I've seen it, sir, he said when we broached the subject. The one in black. Never close, but always there. Brackley had witnessed the figure at several funerals, yet his tone shifted when we mentioned the burial of the young governess, Miss Lonsdale. "There was something different that day," he murmured. "The others, the figure just stood, silent as a statue, never flinched, never moved. But this time, I swear I saw it weep." Holmes straightened slightly. "You are certain of that?" The man nodded. "There was a tremble in the shoulders, just for a moment, and then, quick as anything, it turned and vanished down the path." "And you observed this from where?" "From the chapel door. I was early with the shovels, hadn't yet gone round, but I know what I saw." Holmes offered no reply for some moments, then asked quietly, "Did the figure ever approach the mourners?" "Never," said Brackley, "as if it feared the living more than the dead." Holmes thanked him and turned away. "Emotion, Watson," he said in a low tone. "Not feigned, not dramatic, but real. Controlled, yes, but just once, allowed to slip. We are closer than I thought." Later that afternoon, at Holmes's behest, I undertook the somewhat morbid task of sketching a rough map of the graveyard, particularly the locations of the 8 graves associated with the mourners' appearances. I moved among the stones in the growing dusk, noting names, dates, and positions, while Holmes watched in contemplative silence from the chapel steps. When I presented the completed diagram, Holmes studied it with evident absorption. "Now look, Watson," he said, tracing a gloved finger along the paper. "Here is Mrs. Cartwright, northwest corner. Here the clerk, directly south. And here the Lonsdale girl, east of the central path." He stepped back. "Does it strike you as random?" "I should say so," I replied. "There is no geometric alignment I can see." "Not geometric," Holmes said. "Temporal." He withdrew a small notebook from his coat and aligned the map beside it. "You see, when overlaid with the order of interments," he murmured, "there is a progression, not of location, but of chronology. The figure moves through time, not space. The graves are not chosen for their place in the ground, but for their moment in memory." I stared at the page, slowly discerning what he had observed. The order matched precisely the dates of death, not their position on the plot. "It is a journey, Watson, one of mourning, step by step." I said nothing, for a curious chill had come over me. Holmes folded the map carefully and placed it in his coat. "Which means," he concluded, "that the figure will return soon." That evening brought with it a chill mist that crept through the streets of Hampstead like a living veil, muffling footsteps and casting even the faintest lamplight into trembling halos. Holmes, dressed in the rough attire of a cemetery labourer, took up position near the low stone wall bordering the eastern entrance. I remained at a discreet distance, concealed behind the vicarage hedgerow with a borrowed coat and a pair of opera glasses Holmes had thoughtfully pressed into my hand. It had been announced in the local obituary column that a funeral was to take place that evening for one Mr. Edwin Mallory, a name fabricated, of course, by Holmes himself, and affixed to a headstone recently prepared for the purpose. The ruse was modest, yet sufficient to test whether the mourner acted upon specific deaths or responded to the mere form of the ceremony. The minutes passed with excruciating slowness. A crow cawed once from the trees, then silence. The church bells had ceased. A faint shiver ran through the branches. And then I saw it. From the far end of the path emerged the figure, tall, thin, shrouded in black from head to toe. The veil concealed every feature, but the slow, deliberate gait was unmistakable. The mourner paused at the edge of the freshly prepared grave, standing utterly motionless. Holmes did not stir, nor did I, scarcely breathing as I watched. After a long moment, the figure knelt, precisely as described, and reached beneath the folds of its cloak. A single object was drawn forth and placed upon the soil. Though I could not see it clearly, I knew with a certainty born of instinct what it must be. The white rose. There was no sound, no word, only the fog and the figure and the grave. And then, like smoke upon the wind, it was gone. It was 2 days after our nocturnal observation that word reached us of another funeral. This time for one Sergeant Harold Dempsey, a veteran of the Afghan campaigns, whose passing had stirred a modest flurry of remembrance among the local military societies. The service was to be held in the very same churchyard at St. Jude's, and Holmes, sensing opportunity, proposed that we attend in the guise of passers-by. The day was bleak, with a chill that gnawed at the hands and a grey sky that threatened rain. We took up unobtrusive positions along the perimeter, Holmes beneath a tree that afforded a view of the path, and I behind a row of stone angels, my eyes alert to every motion among the mourners. The service itself was brief and unremarkable, save for the palpable dignity of the assembled veterans. It was only as the final prayer echoed over the quiet ground that Holmes inclined his head slightly, a signal. I followed the direction of his gaze. There, at the edge of the procession, stood the figure once more, veiled, silent, still. The posture was unmistakable. The very air about it seemed charged with tension, as if the act of presence were itself a strain against some vast sorrow. As the crowd began to disperse, the figure remained unmoved. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, it turned and slipped through a gap in the hedge bordering the eastern wall. Holmes sprang up at once, and we gave chase, but fog and distance were the figure's allies. By the time we reached the lane beyond, there was no trace, no echo of footfall, no impression in the damp earth, only a faint imprint on the low stone ledge where the mourner had paused, a single flattened petal from what must have been another rose. Holmes stooped, his eyes alight. "He was here," he said softly, "and he left us a gift." The petal, though partially crumpled, retained a curious strength, as if time had passed over it without full dominion. Holmes placed it gently within a folded sheet of wax paper and tucked it into his inner pocket. We returned to the rectory, where he commandeered the Reverend's study for a short analysis. Holmes unwrapped the specimen upon a sheet of plain parchment and held it to his nose with a care that bordered on reverence. "Curious," he muttered. "Most curious. Watson, do you perceive anything unusual?" I took the petal in hand. A faint odour lingered upon it. Not floral, but vaguely chemical. Not unpleasant, but certainly unexpected. "Preservative," Holmes said. "Not the kind one finds in funeral parlours. This is older. Herbarium grade, I suspect. Something used to maintain botanical specimens. Arsenical soap, perhaps, or camphor." I looked at him, puzzled. "You believe the rose was artificially preserved?" "Without question. It was dried, yes. But not simply with time. It was treated, intentionally. Preserved not for display, but for endurance." He leaned back, his fingers steepled. "This is no spontaneous gesture, Watson. It is symbolic, repeated, deliberate, steeped in private meaning. Each grave receives the same token, the same rose, not plucked from the garden, but prepared long before. Our mourner carries with him the past, not only in grief, but in relic." He rose and tapped the glass thoughtfully. "Now, let us revisit the governess. I believe her past may prove less obscure than her obituary suggests." The following morning, we called upon Miss Lonsdale's last known employers, a genteel but evidently fading household on the far side of Camden. The lady of the house, Mrs. Ellicott, received us with a mixture of suspicion and relief, confessing that the sudden death of her former governess had left a number of questions unanswered. She was quiet, Mrs. Ellicott said, reserved, a good instructor, but there was a sadness in her, like an old wound poorly hidden. Holmes inquired as to her origins. Mrs. Ellicott hesitated, then retrieved a faded envelope from a drawer. She came to us from a family in Cornwall, the Merryweathers, but they dissolved the household nearly a decade ago. There was some legal dispute, I believe. A will. It was hushed up. Did she speak of them? Holmes asked. Only once, Mrs. Ellicott replied. And it frightened her. I asked if she had fond memories of Cornwall, and she turned pale. She said, "There are places that bury more than people." Holmes made a brief notation, then stood. "You have been of great service, madam." Outside he walked briskly, the wind tugging at his coat. "The Merryweathers, Watson, I recall the name. A notorious inheritance battle, fraud, guardianship disputes, 3 wards unaccounted for. It made the court pages briefly before being suppressed. And Clara Lonsdale was likely one of the unaccounted." He tapped his walking stick sharply. "Each grave, Watson, each name, they are not chosen at random. They are chosen from memory, and perhaps from the remnants of a vanished past. The orphanage is not a theory, it is a certainty." It was late in the afternoon when Holmes proposed an errand of a most particular nature. We walked to a modest undertaking establishment on the outskirts of the parish, a place he had noted during our initial visit, and which now took on sudden importance in his evolving chain of deductions. The shop was manned by a lean and rather nervous young man named Alfred Keene, whose cheeks flushed deeply when Holmes introduced himself. "We are not here on business, Mr. Keene," Holmes began, "but upon an inquiry concerning one of your former funeral attendees." The apprentice blinked. "You mean the black-clad one?" "Yes, sir, I've seen him." Holmes's expression did not change. "Describe what you saw and when." Keene fidgeted, then blurted, "Well, it's just, I'd seen them before, but it wasn't a woman. Or if it was, she looked like a man. Or," he halted, flustered. Holmes leaned forward. "Do you mean you once saw the mourner without the veil?" Keene nodded. "Not the face. Just, there was a funeral last year, not long after I started. The figure came in late, stayed back, same black dress. But as I watched him go, the wind caught the coat, and I saw boots, men's boots, worn and heavy. And the gait, it wasn't ladylike." Holmes nodded once. "You've done well, Mr. Keene. Very well." "Outside," I remarked, "you suspected it?" "I entertained the possibility," Holmes said, "but now it begins to take shape. Our mourner wears the costume of grief, but not the form expected. The disguise is not only for anonymity, it is protection from recognition, which suggests guilt or a past one does not wish to meet. That evening, by the glow of our lamp at the Hampstead Inn, Holmes unfolded a sheet he had acquired from Reverend Pritchard, an expanded list of every funeral at which the mourner had been seen. I watched as he drew up a second column beside each name, checking it against notations in a pocket ledger of his own. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "I have been collecting more than flowers." The names on the left were the deceased. Those on the right were references Holmes had gathered from legal archives, old charitable registries, and the dusty birth rolls of church records. By the time he had completed the cross-reference, he tapped his pen once on the paper. "Each of them, Watson, each of them was once in the care of the saint. Pelagius Orphan House, a private institution closed in 1858 after a quiet but damning inquiry." "Every single one?" I asked. "To the last," he said. I stared at the list in growing astonishment. There were names of children who had become labourers, governesses, soldiers, names that had disappeared into ordinary lives until the mourner appeared beside their graves. "And the orphanage?" I asked. "Gone, demolished, but not forgotten, not by one, at least." He circled one name in particular. "This man, James Holloway, died of a railway accident. The coroner's report listed no next of kin. Yet the mourner came." Holmes paused. This is not vengeance, Watson. Not in the usual sense. We are witnessing a liturgy, a ritual of farewell. Someone is tracing a path through their past. A reckoning, perhaps, but not of blood. I said nothing for a while, the quiet broken only by the scratching of his pen. And you believe the mourner is one of them? I believe, Holmes said softly, the mourner is the last one left. The following day, Holmes received by special courier a bundle of records from an archivist acquaintance in Whitechapel. It included several damning reports from the final years of the St. Pelagius Orphan House, documents long buried beneath administrative indifference. The reports painted a grim picture: malnutrition, beatings, falsified identities, unexplained disappearances, children transferred or dismissed with no trace, staff unvetted and unmonitored. The institution had operated with a degree of secrecy, even in its prime, masking neglect under a veneer of religious piety. What astonishes me, I said, is how this remained unspoken. No trial? No arrests? None, Holmes replied. A quiet closure and a quieter relocation of surviving wards. The names were changed, histories wiped. They were scattered like ash across the country. He opened a document stamped confidential and laid it flat. Here, a list of those relocated under false surnames. And here, our Clara Lonsdale. But more than that, he tapped another line. Elias M., surname withheld, male, age 13. Note, facial scarring from illness, relocated to unnamed northern parish. He leaned back. We have him, Watson, not by name, but by ghost. And you think he is the mourner? I do not think. I know. He closed the folder with care. Now all that remains is to meet him. That evening, as we sat together in our dimly lit lodging, I found myself unsettled in a way I could not articulate. There was no imminent danger, no spectre of violence, but the sorrow that clung to this case had seeped into the very air we breathed. Holmes, I said at length, do you believe we are dealing with a man, or a memory? He did not answer. Outside, the wind stirred the branches in the churchyard. Somewhere far off, a bell tolled, not for ceremony, but for the hour. I found myself thinking not of criminals or clues, but of those unnamed children, scattered across time and space, their graves unmarked save by a single rose. I have seen many strange things, I said quietly, but never one who mourns for the forgotten. Holmes remained at the window, his gaze fixed upon something I could not see. When he finally spoke, it was with great softness. Some crimes, Watson, he murmured, are not punished by the law, but by the persistence of grief. It was upon our return to Baker Street that Holmes, with the air of a chess player moving his final piece into position, laid out his plan in full. The case, he remarked, had reached the stage not of pursuit, but of invitation. The mourner must come to them, and so Holmes resolved to extend an irresistible summons. He composed a notice for the Times, brief, dignified, and utterly fictitious. It announced the death of one Mr. Jonathan Elmsworth, aged 54, formerly of the late St. Pelagius Orphan House and a resident of the Eastbourne Parish Home for Retired Clerks. The funeral was to be held at Hampstead Cemetery on the following Thursday at 3 o'clock. But Elmsworth never existed, I said, examining the draft. Precisely, Holmes replied. He is a ghost among ghosts. But to one who remembers the institution, the name will not matter. The detail, the place, the phrasing. It will carry weight. It will strike the correct chord. He arranged for the name to be added to the burial schedule and secured a blank headstone bearing the false initials. The mourner has followed memory, he said, from the outside in. Let us see whether he will be drawn to a final echo. And if he comes, Holmes's eyes gleamed, then we shall greet him with silence and with courtesy, and at last, with truth. It was not a trap in the traditional sense. There would be no struggle, no pursuit. But Holmes had constructed something altogether more delicate, a stage upon which memory and deception might meet at last beneath the shadow of a name that never was, but meant everything. The day of the fabricated funeral dawned grey and damp, the sort of weather that seemed to soak into one's very thoughts. A small assemblage had gathered. Most were in Holmes's employ, though a few curious parishioners had also arrived, drawn by the printed announcement. I stood near the grave, hat in hand, murmuring the occasional word to maintain the illusion. At precisely 3 o'clock, the mourner arrived. I recognized the figure immediately. Tall, veiled, wrapped in sable garments from crown to toe, moving with a grace both solemn and watchful. The head bowed slightly, as if in recognition of the silence that greeted him. No one spoke. No one moved. Holmes stood some distance away beneath a yew tree, his coat buttoned high and his gaze fixed steadily forward. The mourner took no notice of him, nor of anyone else. He approached the false grave, knelt slowly, and removed from within his cloak a single white rose. It was laid upon the soil with almost reverent care. Then the figure rose and turned, retreating the way he had come. I felt my breath catch as I watched the movement, so precise, so ritualistic, so achingly familiar. Holmes raised his hand slightly, a signal to the officers stationed at the perimeter. The time had come. With practiced precision, 2 plainclothes constables emerged from the distant hedges, not rushing but converging steadily upon the narrow pathway where the mourner had turned. I advanced from the opposite side, though careful to maintain the air of a bystander until Holmes nodded to me directly. The figure slowed, perhaps sensing the movement, but did not flee. The shoulders stiffened, the gloved hands gripped the cloak more tightly at the chest. "Sir," Holmes called quietly, stepping forward at last, "there is no danger here. We ask only that you speak with us." There was a moment's stillness. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, the figure darted to the right, aiming for the break between 2 trees that flanked the lower cemetery gate. But Holmes was faster than I had anticipated. With long strides, he intercepted the mourner before the figure could pass, placing himself squarely in the path and seizing hold of the cloak. There was no violent struggle, only a moment of resistance and then stillness. Holmes gently drew back the veil. I saw then the face of a man, scarred, hollow-eyed, and utterly human. The eyes were not mad, but flooded with a sorrow beyond words. The man stared at Holmes, and then at me, before falling to his knees. He did not speak. He wept. For one charged moment, all stood still, the constables frozen in their positions, Holmes with his hands still extended, and the veiled figure poised as though weighing the full weight of flight against the risk of capture. Then, as if struck by an unseen force, the mourner turned sharply and bolted down the narrow gravel path that wound toward the lower exit gate, his cloak trailing behind him like the wake of a ship. The motion was swift, practiced, neither clumsy nor panicked. This was not the flailing escape of a cornered thief, but the desperate bolt of a man accustomed to fleeing shadows. Holmes moved immediately, his steps swift and sure, cutting across the lawn with an agility that defied his usual languor. I followed in close pursuit, though already the mourner had gained a lead of several yards. "Stop him!" I called to one of the constables, but the figure had already veered from the path, darting between rows of weathered headstones. For an instant, he vanished behind a stone crypt, and I feared we had lost him once more to the mist. But Holmes, with unerring instinct, had anticipated the move. As the mourner re-emerged along the far side of the hedge, Holmes intercepted him, arms extended not in violence, but in firm resistance. There was a scuffle, a shifting of balance, and then the chase was over. The 2 men stood locked for an instant, Holmes with both hands gripping the shoulders of the figure, the mourner rigid, unmoving, like some spectre seized in mid-flight. There was no outcry, no struggle beyond the sudden halt of momentum. Only the sound of our hurried steps upon the gravel and the sharp intake of breath as we approached. Holmes, with remarkable gentleness, reached for the veil. The fabric, thin, black and trembling with the weight of breath beneath, was lifted slowly, reverently, as one might draw back the curtain of an altar. And there, at last, was the face. It was a man, middle-aged, though his features were gaunt with hunger and lined by sorrow beyond his years. His left cheek bore the faint traces of scarring, the skin discoloured and roughened, perhaps from the fever Holmes had once suspected. The eyes, dark and sunken, were fixed not upon Holmes, but somewhere far away, as if recalling a place that no longer existed. His lips trembled, but no words came. Holmes held his gaze, not with triumph, but with understanding. He said nothing, neither did I. The man's knees gave way beneath him. He sank slowly, as if the last of his strength had drained in that final sprint, and came to rest upon the cold earth. One gloved hand clutched the empty space where the rose had been. The other rose briefly, as if to shield his face, but fell again in resignation. I bent beside him, ready to speak, to ask who he was, what he wanted. But Holmes touched my arm lightly. "Not now, Watson," he murmured. "He has nothing left to hide, and nothing left to fear." Behind us, footsteps approached. Inspector Lestrade, delayed but diligent, stepped into view. Holmes stood. "Wait," he said simply. Lestrade surveyed the scene with his usual briskness. "Is this the fellow, then?" he asked, glancing from Holmes to the kneeling figure. Holmes nodded, though his eyes did not leave the man upon the ground. "Name?" Lestrade pressed. "I doubt he would give one," Holmes replied. "But I believe it to be Elias Marlowe, once a child of the St. Pelagius Orphan House, now its last surviving witness." The inspector frowned. "Charges?" Holmes turned at last. "None." "No theft?" "No." "No assault?" "None that would hold in any court governed by reason." Lestrade stepped forward. "He ran, caused a disturbance. Might be enough to hold him." Holmes raised a hand, not abruptly, but with finality. "He has committed no crime, Lestrade, only remembrance. That is not an offence in any statute." The inspector looked unconvinced. "He trespassed in the affairs of the living," Holmes continued, "but only to mourn the forgotten dead. Every grave he visited was one tied to his past, fellow wards, long-lost caretakers, those whose names would otherwise have passed into nothingness. He preserved a rose for each of them, not to desecrate, but to honour." Lestrade hesitated. "Even so, he fled." Holmes's voice was quiet. "Because he feared misunderstanding, because men like us carry badges and books of law, but not always justice." There was silence. Then Lestrade, to his credit, sighed. "Well, if you're satisfied, Mr. Holmes, I am." Lestrade gave a curt nod and turned away, his footsteps retreating into the fog. I watched as the man, Elias, lifted his head at last. There were tears upon his cheeks, but his gaze was steady. Holmes extended his hand, not as an officer of the law, but as a man. Elias took it. And in that gesture, silent, spare, unremarked, there was more absolution than any court could render. We returned to Baker Street the following evening, the city once again swallowing us into its familiar din. The lamps burned low in our sitting room, casting long shadows across Holmes's worn armchair, his violin case, and the heap of correspondence that had accumulated during our absence. Yet it seemed to me that the fog which hung outside the window had crept indoors as well, thin, silent, persistent. Holmes removed his gloves and coat with his usual economy of motion, but for once said nothing. I poured us each a measure of brandy and sat opposite him, noting the rare stillness in his features. He was not brooding, nor triumphant. He was quiet. "It was a strange case," I said at last. "Yes," Holmes murmured. "Strange and necessary." He remained gazing into the fire, the fingers of one hand lightly tapping the arm of his chair. "There was no crime, Holmes, not in the ordinary sense. There was a tragedy, Watson, which is far more lasting." Outside, the bells of Westminster chimed the quarter hour. Holmes finally turned to me. "Do you recall in childhood how some boys kept pressed flowers in their books?" "I do." He nodded. Elias Marlowe pressed his entire life between silence and grief. It was time someone turned the page. Holmes produced a slim dossier from the side drawer of his desk, bound with a single black ribbon. "I asked Mycroft to verify a few final details," he said. "This, Watson, is the life of Elias Marlowe, at least what remains of it." I opened the folder and scanned the notes. Born in 1845. Committed to St. Pelagius Orphan House, following the deaths of his parents in a tenement fire. Listed as Elias M. in the orphanage ledger. No known relatives. He contracted scarlet fever in his 14th year, Holmes explained. Survived, but left with partial facial disfigurement and chronic weakness. He was eventually relocated under a falsified surname and sent to a workhouse in Lancashire. He pointed to a second sheet. There, he disappears from formal record, only to re-emerge years later as a travelling clerk under the name Elias Marlowe. It was likely an assumed name, adopted not for deception, but as an act of reclamation. He kept no fixed address and held no long employment. "And yet," I said, "he found every one of them." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. Over decades, Elias traced the scattered remnants of his childhood, fellow wards, caretakers, staff. Some he mourned with forgiveness, others, I suspect, with bitterness. But he mourned them all. He preserved their names in a private ledger. And when each passed into death, he brought the rose." "Why the disguise?" I asked. "Because some would remember the child he had been, and recoil, because scars, physical and emotional, invite cruelty as well as pity. He had known both." I stared down at the final entry in the dossier, an ink sketch of the man's face, drawn from Lestrade's brief observation. Did he ever intend harm? Holmes shook his head. "Number." "He meant only to be seen, once, quietly, before they disappeared forever." Holmes lit a cigarette and took a long pull, the smoke curling upward like the last breath of something long buried. "St. Pelagius," he said, "a place whose stones should have been torn out one by one." He reached for the file again, pulling free a yellow document marked Internal Memorandum. Church Oversight Committee, 1857. "This report," he continued, "was suppressed at the time. It details malnutrition, repeated corporal punishment, medical neglect, and, most damning, evidence of falsified deaths." "Falsified deaths?" I echoed. Holmes nodded grimly. To relieve overcrowding, unwanted children were declared dead on paper and quietly transferred to labour farms, unregulated parish homes, and, in some cases, into the care of industrial employers. In short, sold. I felt a chill settle upon me. And no one stopped it? There were whispers, a minor public inquiry. But no conviction followed. The institution was quietly closed the following year. The building sold for private use. It burned in 1862. An end of sorts. He placed the document down. Elias was among those falsified, but he survived, and from the ashes of that place, he rose, not to strike back, but to honour the dead left behind. And those he visited, each one had some link to it. Each and every one, either a fellow orphan or a staff member, some likely complicit, others merely incidental. But to Elias, they were pieces of a shattered past. The rose, withered, preserved, was not a symbol of blame. It was remembrance. There was a pause. I turned my gaze to the fire. How many others like him, do you suppose? Holmes shook his head. I dare not guess, but I suspect many died before they could give voice to their story. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Elias chose to remember what others chose to forget. That, Watson, was both his punishment and his redemption. For the better part of 3 decades, Elias Marlowe had lived as a shadow, a man drifting on the margins of society, unnoticed, unnamed, and unclaimed by the world that had failed him. Yet, in his obscurity, he undertook a task more deliberate and more devoted than any I had witnessed in all my years beside Holmes. Imagine, Holmes said, the effort required. To trace individuals lost not only to time, but to bureaucracy. To find those whose names were changed, whose records were buried, whose identities were paper-thin. And to follow their lives, however humble, to their inevitable ends. It was not bitterness that drove Elias, nor was it a thirst for justice in the legal sense. Rather, it was the compulsion of a man who had once been erased, attempting, quietly, solemnly, to write his own memory into the pages of others. He mourned them all, Holmes continued. Those who abused, those who neglected, and those who suffered beside him. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to witness, to say, "You lived, I remember." We had found among his possessions a worn notebook, each page dedicated to a single name. Some entries were spare. Agnes T. died of consumption, soft voice, sang to herself. Others bore more detail. One read, "Brother Daniel punished us for bedwetting, beaten with cane. We were 7, buried in Surrey." But in each case, beside the name, was the drawing of a single rose, always white, always half-faded. "He carried them with him," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, and placed them not with hatred, but with ritual. There was something sacred in the man's acts, a funeral liturgy performed in isolation. No congregation, no sermon, only the dead, the mourner, and the silence that bound them. It was, in its way, a kind of devotion. The rose, that silent emblem left upon each grave, had become the most haunting aspect of the affair. Its presence, repeated with unwavering consistency, invited not only curiosity, but reverence. It was Holmes who first observed the peculiar scent, and it was he who uncovered its secret. "It is not merely dried," he explained, "but preserved, chemically and with deliberate care. This is not the decay of time, Watson, but the defiance of it." He had analysed the remnants of one such flower, noting traces of camphor oil, alum, and a mild concentration of arsenical preservative, a method employed in the preparation of botanical samples in the mid-century. The craftsmanship suggested knowledge, even tenderness. These were not plucked at random, he said. They were collected, perhaps even cultivated long ago, pressed and kept. Each rose was a relic. I had assumed wrongly that the rose might have contained poison, some final sting left as vengeance for a forgotten cruelty. But Holmes dismissed the notion outright. "No, Watson, this was not a weapon, it was a word." "A word?" "Yes, in a language not spoken aloud, the language of remembrance. The white rose, faded, fragile, enduring, says what Elias could not, that they were known, that they were not alone." I found myself turning the phrase over in my mind, unable to shake the weight of it. "It is a strange justice," I murmured. Holmes gave the barest smile. Justice of a kind rarely administered in court, and far more permanent. The newspapers, when they caught wind of the tale, seized upon the more sensational elements. "The Phantom of the Cemetery," one headline read, "A haunting unmasked." But none of them grasped the essence of the man behind the veil. They spoke of mystery and disguise, of childhood trauma and grotesque institutions. But they did not speak of mourning. Holmes, I think, understood this more keenly than anyone. Elias was no spectre, he told me, as we read one such article aloud. He was not a ghost returned to avenge the past. He was its last survivor. It would have been easy to cast him as mad, or dangerous, or broken beyond repair. And yet there had been nothing incoherent in his actions. He kept no weapons, made no threats. His grief was not theatrical, but quiet, measured by steps walked in darkness and petals placed by hand. He harmed no one, Holmes said simply. He sought only to witness. And that, perhaps, was what made it so moving. For in a world increasingly deaf to sorrow, here was a man who chose to listen, who bore witness not to glory or triumph, but to pain, who marked not victories, but absences. He was not a monster. He was a mourner, and that is all he ever asked to be. In the days that followed, I found myself returning often to the ledger of names Elias had kept. I read it not as a record of guilt, but of memory. Each entry, brief, unassuming, struck me as more human than any testimony I'd heard in a court of law. There was a dignity in his silence, a restraint that made even the coldest detail feel sacred. He had never asked to be seen, and yet when seen, he did not run from pity, only from misunderstanding. I thought of my own life, my years in medicine, my service in war, and could not help but wonder whether any man who has lived through great sorrow can ever truly forget the faces of those who shared it. Some bury their grief in time. Elias had carried his. He had turned it into a ritual, a memory, a rose. And I, who had seen blood and death in all its forms, found myself humbled by one who did neither harm nor heal, but remembered. That evening, as we sat once more in our Baker Street rooms, the case complete and the world already forgetting, Holmes stirred from his quiet and spoke. "You see, Watson," he said, "there are cases the law cannot touch, not because they escape it, but because they surpass it." I looked up. "Justice, you mean?" "No," he said. "Remembrance." He reached for his violin, tuning the strings slowly, thoughtfully. Elias sought no revenge. He asked no verdict. He gave no testimony. His was a case not of evidence, but of endurance. He played a single note, low, long, fading into the firelit silence. "Justice is a matter of consequence," he continued, "but mourning is a matter of conscience." I said nothing, for there was nothing to add, and as the fog rolled once more against the panes of Baker Street, I knew that Holmes, ever the man of logic, had glimpsed something greater than deduction. A truth, not of reason, but of memory. And that night, even he did not chase it away. As we sat in our Baker Street sitting room that night, the fire crackling low and the world outside muffled by a soft rain, I turned to Holmes, who had spoken little since Elias's quiet departure. "You never judged him," I said. Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of smoke. "There was nothing to judge, Watson, only to understand." He tapped his fingers twice on the arm of his chair. "We spend our lives chasing facts, motives, and means, but there are sorrows so old, so intricately threaded through the soul, that they defy reason. Elias was not hiding from justice. He was hiding inside memory." He paused, the flicker of the fire dancing across his face. "It is easy to expose a lie," he murmured, "but infinitely harder to honor a truth too painful to speak aloud. Tell me this. If Elias had never revealed himself, never wept, never left a trace, would anyone have known there was a mystery at all? What do you think was the most revealing clue that unraveled his hidden identity? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What moved you most about this case? And if you enjoy these mysteries, Don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures. Share this story with a friend who loves a case as haunting as it is human. The next mystery awaits. History.